Have you ever wondered if someone could be convicted, executed, and only later found to be innocent? In 1944, in the small town of Alcaloo, South Carolina, a case began that would later be remembered as one of the most troubling examples of justice gone wrong in American history. A 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. was arrested in connection with the deaths of two young white girls, Mary Emma Thames and Betty June Binnicker. The discovery of their bodies shocked the small, segregated community, and pressure to find a suspect quickly became intense. George was soon taken into custody. From the beginning, the case moved at a pace that would later raise serious questions. Witness accounts were limited, physical evidence was unclear, and many details of the investigation were never properly documented in a way that met modern legal standards. George was interrogated, without a lawyer present, and according to later court reviews, he was questioned for hours under circumstances that many legal experts now consider deeply problematic. At the time, he was just a child, barely able to understand the seriousness of what was happening around him. Shortly after his arrest, George allegedly confessed. However, years later, this confession would become one of the most disputed parts of the entire case, with questions raised about whether it was voluntary, properly recorded, or even reliable. Despite the lack of physical evidence presented in detail, the case went to trial extremely quickly. The trial itself lasted only a single day. George's defense was minimal. He had a court-appointed attorney, but later analysis of the trial suggests that his defense was not adequately prepared or supported. There were no meaningful efforts to challenge the prosecution's claims in a strong or structured way. After only a brief deliberation, the jury found George Stinney Jr. guilty. He was sentenced to death. At just 14 years old, George became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. Because of his age and the legal restrictions of the time, he was executed in the electric chair. Reports say he was so small that he had to sit on a Bible to properly fit into the chair. After his execution, the case faded from public attention for many years. But within the legal community, questions never fully disappeared. Decades later, historians, legal experts, and civil rights advocates began re-examining the case in detail. What they found raised serious doubts about whether George had ever received a fair trial. There were concerns about racial bias in the justice system at the time, the speed of the trial, the lack of proper legal representation, and the absence of strong, verifiable physical evidence presented in court records. Over time, the case became widely discussed as an example of how deeply flawed legal processes can lead to irreversible outcomes. Then, in 2014, 70 years after George Stinney Jr. was executed, a South Carolina judge officially reviewed the case again. After examining the historical record, the court ruled that George Stinney Jr. had not received a fair trial. The conviction was formally vacated. Legally, this meant that the conviction was erased as if it should not have stood in the first place. But the ruling could not change what had already happened. George had already been executed decades earlier. He never lived to see the clearing of his name. He never got to hear the judgment that he was not given a fair chance in court, and no retrial was possible. Today, his case is often cited in discussions about wrongful convictions, especially those involving minors and systemic bias. It remains a painful reminder of how quickly justice can be carried out, and how long it can take for mistakes to be acknowledged. And even now, the story leaves behind a disturbing question that still lingers in American legal history. How many other cases were never revisited and never corrected in time?